Picture two people who both want to get in shape. One of them sets a huge, dramatic goal: lose 30 pounds in 3 months, run a marathon by the end of the year. The other one doesn't focus on a goal at all. Instead, they just decide to become the kind of person who doesn't miss a workout. 2 years later, almost without exception, the second person is in dramatically better shape than the first. Not because their goal was bigger or smaller, but because one of them built a system, and the other one just chased a finish line. This single idea, that lasting change comes from systems and identity, not from goals and willpower, is the foundation of one of the most influential personal development books of the last decade. The book is called Atomic Habits, and it was written by a man whose own life was nearly derailed by a single, violent moment most people have never heard about. In high school, this author was hit directly in the face with a baseball bat during a freak accident on the field. His skull was shattered in multiple places. He lost consciousness, had to be placed in a medically induced coma, and for a while, doctors weren't even sure he'd survive, let alone return to playing sports. He did survive, but his path back wasn't built on some massive, dramatic comeback. It was built on tiny, almost laughably small daily habits, the kind most people would dismiss as pointless. Years later, that same young man became an all-American athlete, and years after that, he turned everything he'd learned about small, consistent changes into a book that has now sold more than 20 million copies worldwide. In this video, I'm going to break down everything you actually need to know from that book. Not a shallow 5-minute overview, but a full, practical walkthrough you can start applying the moment you finish watching. We'll cover why most people fail to change their habits, the real story behind how this method was discovered, the 4-part framework at the heart of the entire system, and exactly how to use it whether you're trying to build a new habit or finally break free of an old one. Stick with me to the end, because the very last section is the part most people skip, and it's the part that actually makes any of this stick long term. Let's start with an uncomfortable truth. Most people who try to change a habit, whether it's exercising more, eating better, reading more, or quitting something, fail not because they lack discipline, and not because they don't want it badly enough. They fail because they're using the wrong unit of change. They focus on goals, and goals, by their very nature, are temporary. A goal is something you either achieve or you don't, and the moment you hit it or the moment you give up on it, the goal disappears. That's exactly why so many people who finally hit a big goal, lose the weight, finish the marathon, hit the sales target, end up sliding right back to where they started a few months later. The goal was achieved, but nothing about their actual day-to-day system changed. Here's a different way to think about it. If you want better results, stop focusing on the results themselves and start focusing on the system that produces those results. Winners and losers often have the exact same goals. Every team in a league wants to win the championship. Every job applicant wants to get the offer. The goal was never the differentiating factor. What separates the people who actually get there from everyone else is the quality of the systems they built and stuck with along the way. This connects to another core idea: the difference between outcomes, processes, and identity. Outcomes are about what you get, the trophy, the number on the scale, the published book. Processes are about what you do, your habits and routines. And identity is about what you believe, the story you tell yourself about who you are. Most people try to change from the outside in. They set an outcome, lose 15 pounds, then try to force a process onto themselves to hit it, often through sheer willpower, while their underlying identity never shifts. They still secretly think of themselves as someone who isn't really athletic or someone who's bad with money. And as long as that underlying identity stays the same, the new behavior feels like a constant uphill fight, because you're fighting against your own self-image every single day. The far more effective approach works in the opposite direction, from the inside out. You start by deciding who you want to be. Not "I want to run a marathon," but "I am a runner." Not "I want to write a book," but "I am a writer." Then every single habit becomes a small vote for that identity. Every time you lace up your shoes and go for even a short, slow run, you're not just burning calories, you're casting a vote for "I am a runner." Every time you sit down and write even one paragraph, you're casting a vote for "I am a writer." No single vote transforms your identity on its own, but enough votes, repeated consistently, eventually convince you at a deep level that the identity is actually true. And once you genuinely believe it, the behavior stops requiring willpower altogether. It becomes simply who you are. This is also exactly why so many attempts at change fail in a sneaky, invisible way. People change their habits without ever updating the underlying belief. They might force themselves to eat salads for a month while privately still thinking, "I just don't have the willpower to eat healthy." The behavior changed temporarily, but the identity didn't. And as soon as motivation dips even slightly, the old identity wins, and the old behavior comes right back. Now let's talk about why tiny habits matter so much more than people give them credit for, because this is really the heart of the entire book, hidden right there in the title. The word atomic doesn't just mean tiny. It also means a fundamental building block, a small unit that's part of a much larger system. The argument is that habits work the exact same way. A single habit on its own looks insignificant, but it's actually one tiny atomic unit inside the much larger compound system of your entire life. Here's the math that makes this idea so powerful. If you get just 1% better at something every single day for 1 year, by the end of that year, you're not just 37% better, you're roughly 37 times better than when you started, because improvements compound, multiplying on top of each other rather than simply adding up. The flip side is just as real and far more dangerous. Get just 1% worse every day, and by the end of the year, you've nearly bottomed out. The difference between a thriving life and a stagnant one is rarely some single, dramatic event. It's the compounded result of thousands of small choices, repeated daily, in one direction or the other. This is exactly why people so often feel disappointed after a few weeks of trying to change. They go to the gym 3 times, eat clean for a week, meditate for a few days, see no dramatic result, and conclude the new habit isn't working. This is one of the most important concepts in the entire book, something that could be called the plateau of latent potential. Picture an ice cube sitting in a room that's slowly warming up, degree by degree. Nothing visibly happens at 25 degrees, 26, 27, all the way up to 31. Then, at 32 degrees, suddenly the ice begins to melt, even though the very last degree of warming wasn't fundamentally different from any of the ones before it. All of that earlier, invisible effort wasn't wasted. It was being stored, waiting for the right threshold to be crossed. Habits work exactly the same way. The first few weeks of a new habit often produce frustratingly little visible change, not because the habit isn't working, but because the results are being stored below the surface, like that slowly warming room, until you cross a threshold, and the results suddenly seem to appear out of nowhere. Most people quit during that invisible valley, right before the breakthrough they were actually building toward. Now let's talk about how habits actually work at a mechanical level, because understanding this mechanism is what makes the rest of this video actually useful, instead of just inspiring. Every single habit, no matter how complex it looks from the outside, follows the same basic 4-step loop. First, there's a cue, something that triggers your brain to start a particular behavior because it predicts a reward is coming. Second, there's a craving, the motivational force behind the habit, the actual desire for the change in state that the reward provides. Third, there's a response, the actual habit you perform, the thought or action you take. And fourth, there's a reward, the end goal of every habit, the thing that satisfies the craving and, just as importantly, teaches your brain that this loop is worth repeating in the future. Let's make this concrete with something almost everyone has experienced. Your phone buzzes with a notification. That's the cue. Immediately, a craving kicks in, a desire to know what that notification is, paired with a deeper craving for social validation or novelty. The response is picking up your phone and opening the app. And the reward is the brief hit of curiosity being resolved, sometimes paired with a dopamine spike if the notification turns out to be something exciting. Your brain registers that this entire loop was rewarding, and the cue, your phone buzzing, becomes even more strongly associated with the response of picking it up, making the habit a little bit stronger and a little more automatic the next time around. This four-step loop can be split into two phases: the problem phase and the solution phase. The problem phase includes the cue and the craving. This is where you realize something needs to change. The solution phase includes the response and the reward. This is where you actually take action and get the satisfaction you were craving. Every habit you have, good or bad, is fundamentally just your brain's attempt to solve a problem with as little energy as possible. This brings us to the core framework of the entire system: four practical laws built directly on top of these four stages of the habit loop. To build a good habit, you make it obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. To break a bad habit, you simply invert each one. Make it invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying. Let's go through each one of these in real depth, because this is genuinely the part you can start using literally tomorrow. The first law is making it obvious, and it targets the cue stage of the loop. The basic problem most people have isn't a lack of motivation, it's a lack of awareness. We're remarkably good at not noticing our own habits because so many of them have become invisible to us through repetition. The very first step toward changing any behavior is becoming conscious of it. One of the simplest, most effective tools for this is something you could call a habit scorecard. You simply make a list of your regular daily habits, and for each one, write a single letter next to it. A plus sign for a habit that moves you toward the person you want to be, a minus sign for one that moves you away from it, and an equal sign for one that's neutral. The goal isn't to judge yourself. It's purely to build awareness. You can't change what you don't notice. Once you're aware of your habits, the next tool is something called an implementation intention. Instead of vague intentions like "I'm going to exercise more" or "I'm going to eat healthier," you state a specific plan in this exact format. I will behave here at time and location. For example, I will do 20 push-ups at 7 a.m. in my living room, or I will read for 10 minutes at 9 p.m. in my bedroom. Research on this kind of planning shows that people who write out a specific time and location for a new behavior are dramatically more likely to actually follow through than people who just have a general intention. The reason is simple. A vague intention requires you to make a fresh decision every single day about whether and when to act, and decision-making is exhausting. A specific plan removes that decision entirely. The behavior is already pre-decided. A second closely related strategy is habit stacking, pairing a new habit you want to build with a current habit you already do every day without thinking. The format is: after current habit, I will new habit. For example, after I pour my morning coffee, I will write down 3 things I'm grateful for. Or, after I take off my work shoes, I will immediately change into my workout clothes. This works because you're not relying on motivation or memory to trigger the new habit. You're attaching it to a behavior that's already deeply automatic, essentially borrowing the existing habit's momentum to launch the new one. The final piece of making things obvious is environment design. This might be the single most underrated tool in the entire system, because most people assume habits are purely a matter of internal willpower, when in reality, the environment you've set up around yourself is often a far stronger predictor of your behavior than your personality or motivation ever will be. Want to drink more water during the day? Place a large water bottle on your desk where you can see it. Want to read more? Put a book on your pillow every morning instead of on a shelf across the room. Want to stop snacking on junk food at night? Don't bring it into the house in the first place, or at the very least, store it somewhere inconvenient, out of sight, on a high shelf, in the back of the pantry. Every environment is essentially a landscape of invisible cues constantly nudging your behavior in one direction or another. Redesign that landscape, and you change the behavior almost automatically, without ever needing to rely on motivation in the moment. Now, to break a bad habit, you simply flip this first law around. Make the cue invisible. If you're trying to spend less time on your phone, the most effective move isn't relying on raw willpower to resist checking it. It's removing the cue altogether, charging your phone in another room overnight, deleting the specific apps that pull you in most, or turning off notifications entirely so there's no buzz to react to in the first place. You're not trying to win a fight against temptation. You're trying to make sure the fight never has to happen at all. The second law is making it attractive, and this one targets the craving stage. Habits are, at their core, a dopamine-driven feedback loop. The release of dopamine isn't just tied to the experience of pleasure itself, it's tied to the anticipation of pleasure. This is exactly why a craving, the moment right before you act, can sometimes feel even more intense than the reward itself. One powerful tool here is something called temptation bundling, deliberately pairing an action you want to do with an action you need to do. For instance, only allowing yourself to watch your favorite show while you're on the treadmill, or only listening to a podcast you love while you're doing household chores you'd normally avoid. By linking something you're already drawn to with a behavior you're trying to build, you make the entire habit noticeably more attractive before you've even started. Another major factor in this law is the influence of culture and social environment. We tend to imitate the habits of three particular groups: the close people around us, the large crowd we feel part of, and the powerful people we look up to and want to emulate. This means one of the most effective things you can do to build a new habit isn't a clever trick at all. It's simply joining a group, online or in person, where the behavior you want is already the normal, expected thing to do. If you want to read more, surround yourself with people who read. If you want to get fit, join a community built around fitness. You're not just getting accountability, you're shifting your entire sense of what normal looks like. And we are powerfully drawn to do whatever feels normal among our peers. To make a bad habit unattractive, you flip the script and consciously reframe the mindset around it, highlighting the real benefits of avoiding the bad habit rather than focusing only on what you're giving up can make a significant difference. For example, someone trying to quit smoking might reframe each craving not as deprivation, I can't have a cigarette, but as liberation, I'm becoming someone who doesn't need cigarettes to feel okay. That mental reframe might sound small, but it fundamentally changes whether the habit feels like a restriction or a genuine win. The third law is making it easy, and it targets the response stage, the actual behavior itself. This law is built on a simple but often ignored truth. The most reliable predictor of whether you'll do something isn't how motivated you feel, it's how much friction stands between you and actually doing it. Motivation is unreliable. It rises and falls with your mood, your sleep, your stress levels. Friction, on the other hand, is something you can directly design and control. The goal here is to reduce the number of steps between you and a good habit and increase the number of steps between you and a bad one. If you want to start journaling, don't make it complicated. Keep a notebook and pen sitting open on your nightstand, ready to go, rather than buried in a drawer somewhere. If you want to eat healthier, spend 20 minutes on Sunday pre-chopping vegetables so that on a busy Tuesday night, the healthy option is also the easiest, most convenient option. Every bit of friction you remove from a good habit increases the odds you'll actually follow through when your willpower is running low, which, realistically, is most of the time. One of the most practical tools tied to this law is something called the 2-minute rule. The idea is that almost any habit can be scaled down into a version that takes 2 minutes or less. Read 30 pages becomes read 1 page. Run 3 miles becomes put on your running shoes and step outside. Do a full workout becomes do 1 push-up. This might sound almost too easy to matter, and that's exactly the point. The goal of the 2-minute version isn't to get a great workout or read a great chapter. It's to master the habit of simply showing up. Once showing up becomes automatic, scaling up the intensity becomes far easier because you're no longer fighting the initial resistance of starting. You're just adjusting something you already do consistently. There's also the idea of decisive moments, the small choices that, more than any other single decision, determine the path the rest of your day takes. Choosing to drive past the fast food place instead of pulling in. Choosing to lay out your gym clothes the night before instead of leaving it to chance in the morning. These tiny decisive moments often matter more than an entire day's worth of willpower, because they determine which set of options you'll even be choosing between later. To make a bad habit difficult, you simply increase the friction standing between you and it. If you're trying to cut back on social media, log out of the app every single time you close it, so that logging back in requires typing your password again, adding just enough friction to interrupt the mindless, automatic reach for your phone. Some people go even further and use commitment devices, decisions made in the present that lock in a specific behavior in the future, removing the need for in-the-moment willpower entirely. Freezing a credit card in a block of ice in the freezer so an impulsive purchase requires waiting for it to thaw is a classic, almost comically literal example. But the underlying principle, making the bad habit physically harder to act on, applies to nearly anything you're trying to cut down on. The fourth and final law is making it satisfying, and it targets the reward stage. This one might be the most overlooked law of all, because it deals with an evolutionary mismatch most of us never think about. Our brains evolved to strongly prioritize immediate rewards over delayed ones. For nearly all of human history, that wiring made perfect sense. Immediate rewards were usually tied to immediate survival. But in the modern world, many of the habits that are genuinely good for us, saving money, exercising, eating well, come with rewards that are delayed, sometimes by months or years, while the habits that are bad for us, junk food, scrolling, overspending, tend to deliver an immediate hit of pleasure. This mismatch is exactly why so many people struggle to stick with beneficial habits. The brain prioritizes what feels good right now, not what will pay off eventually. The solution is to deliberately add a small, immediate reward to a habit whose real payoff is delayed, at least until the habit becomes automatic on its own. If you're trying to save money instead of spending it, you might set up an account where, every time you skip a purchase, you transfer that exact amount of money into a clearly visible savings tracker, so you get an instant, tangible sense of progress rather than waiting months to feel like the habit is working. One of the simplest and most powerful tools tied to this law is habit tracking, some kind of visual measure of your progress, a calendar where you mark an X for every day you complete the habit, a habit tracking app, or even just a simple checklist. Tracking does three things at once. It makes the cue obvious, since looking at your tracker reminds you what to do. It makes the process attractive, because watching a streak grow is genuinely satisfying on its own. And it provides an immediate reward, the small but real burst of satisfaction you get from marking today as a win. There's an important companion rule to habit tracking, something you could call never miss twice. Missing a single day of a habit because you're sick, traveling, or just exhausted has almost no measurable long-term impact. What actually destroys a habit isn't one missed day. It's the second missed day. The moment a single slip starts turning into a brand new pattern of not doing the thing at all. If you miss a workout on Monday, the goal isn't to feel guilty. It's simply to make absolutely sure you show up on Tuesday, no matter how small that Tuesday session ends up being. A final, often underestimated piece of this law is accountability. Habits that have an immediate social cost tend to stick far better than habits that are entirely private. A habit contract, a written agreement where you state your goal and specify a real consequence if you fail to follow through, signed in front of one or two accountability partners, dramatically raises your follow-through rate because the cost of failure suddenly becomes immediate and public instead of distant and private. To make a bad habit unsatisfying, you flip this law and attach an immediate cost to it. This is exactly why habit contracts work so well for breaking bad habits too. If breaking your no junk food commitment means handing your accountability partner a meaningful sum of money on the spot, the bad habit suddenly carries an immediate, painful consequence instead of just a vague, distant worry about your health down the road. Now that we've covered the four laws in full, let's talk about a few advanced ideas that take this system from good to genuinely sustainable for years, not just weeks. The first is something you could call the Goldilocks rule. Humans experience peak motivation when they're working on tasks that sit right at the edge of their current abilities. Not too easy, which gets boring fast, and not too hard, which gets discouraging fast. This is why so many people abandon new habits within the first few weeks. They either make the habit so easy that it stops feeling meaningful, or so demanding that it stops feeling achievable. And in both cases, motivation collapses. The fix is to treat your habit as a long-term practice rather than a short-term challenge, gradually increasing the difficulty, only once the current level has genuinely become easy and automatic. The same way a well-designed video game slowly raises its difficulty in step with your growing skill, instead of throwing the hardest level at you on day one. The second advanced idea is the distinction between amateurs and professionals, and it has nothing to do with skill level or how good you currently are at something. It's entirely about consistency in the face of mood. An amateur lets their emotions and circumstances dictate their actions. They only train when they feel like training, only write when inspiration strikes, only show up when conditions feel right. A professional shows up on schedule, no matter how they feel that day, sticking to the system precisely because the system was designed to work even, and especially on the days when motivation is nowhere to be found. This single mindset shift, treating consistency as more valuable than intensity, is one of the most reliable predictors of who actually maintains a habit for years rather than weeks. The third advanced idea is the practice of reflection and review. Habits are powerful because they're automatic, but that same automatic quality is also their biggest weakness. Once a habit becomes unconscious, it becomes very easy to keep running it long after it stopped serving you, or to never notice that small adjustments could make it significantly more effective. The fix is to build in regular, deliberate moments of conscious reflection, a brief weekly check-in on how your habits are actually going, paired with a more thorough review every few months or at the end of each year. During this review, you ask yourself a few honest questions. What's working well right now? What isn't working as well as I'd like? What's one small adjustment I could make going forward? This habit of reviewing your habits, almost paradoxically, is what keeps an automatic system from quietly drifting away from what you actually intended. Let's talk now about the common obstacles that derail people, even after they understand everything we've just covered. Because understanding a framework intellectually and actually living by it day to day are two very different things. The first obstacle is what we might call the "I'll start when I feel ready" trap. People wait for the perfect moment, the start of a new month, a fresh notebook, a less hectic week, before beginning a new habit. The problem is that this perfect moment essentially never arrives, because life is, by nature, messy and unpredictable. The far more reliable approach is starting with an embarrassingly small version of the habit today, using something like the 2-minute rule, rather than waiting for ideal circumstances that may never show up. The second obstacle is over-identifying with a single failed attempt. Someone misses a day, or even a full week, and concludes, "I guess I'm just not someone who can stick with this." This single thought is far more damaging than the missed day itself, because while a missed day has almost no real impact on your long-term progress, a damaged sense of identity can completely derail you for months. Remember the never miss twice rule here. A slip is just a slip, not a referendum on who you fundamentally are. The third obstacle is confusing motion with action. Motion includes things like researching workout plans, reading about productivity, planning a new morning routine in elaborate detail. These feel productive, and they can genuinely be useful as a starting point, but they don't actually move you forward on their own. Action is the workout itself, the actual writing, the actual habit being performed in real life. A lot of people stay stuck in an endless loop of preparation, planning, and research, because motion feels safe and productive without ever risking the discomfort or vulnerability of actually doing the thing. The fourth obstacle is tying your habits too tightly to a specific, narrow goal instead of a broader identity and system. Someone who's training for a marathon might completely stop running the day after the race is over, because the goal has been achieved and there's nothing left pulling them forward. Someone who identifies as a runner keeps running long after any specific race is finished, because the habit was never really about that one goal in the first place. It was about who they've decided to become. Now let's talk about how this framework actually plays out for different kinds of people in real life, because a framework only matters if it can flex to fit an actual, messy human schedule. Consider someone working a demanding 9-to-5 job who wants to start exercising, but genuinely has very little spare time or energy left by the end of the day. For this person, the 2-minute rule is the entire game. Instead of committing to an hour-long gym session they'll likely skip out of exhaustion, they commit to something almost laughably small: 5 minutes of stretching right after work, paired with leaving their gym clothes by the door so the cue is impossible to miss. The goal in the first month isn't fitness. It's proving to themselves that showing up is something they actually do. Consider a parent of young children trying to read more, who feels like every spare moment gets swallowed by their kids' needs. For this person, the most realistic strategy is habit stacking onto something already happening daily: reading for 5 minutes during the exact time their child is brushing their teeth, or keeping a book in the car to read a page or two while waiting in the school pickup line. The habit doesn't need a dedicated hour of silence to count. It just needs a consistent trigger that already exists in their day. Consider a small business owner trying to stop checking work email late into the night, a habit that's quietly wrecking their sleep and their relationships. For this person, the most effective move is making the bad habit invisible and difficult at the same time, removing the email app from their phone's home screen, logging out of the desktop email client every evening so logging back in takes a deliberate, slightly annoying extra step, and physically charging their phone in a different room overnight. None of this requires extraordinary willpower. It just removes the cue and adds friction at exactly the moment's temptation is strongest. Consider a college student trying to study more consistently instead of cramming the night before every exam. For this person, environment design does most of the heavy lifting. Studying happens at one specific desk. used only for studying, never for browsing social media or watching videos, so that simply sitting down at that desk becomes a strong, automatic cue for focused work. Phone goes in a drawer in another room, or at minimum, in airplane mode in a backpack pocket, removing the temptation entirely rather than relying on willpower to resist it mid-session. The common thread across every one of these examples is this: none of them rely on raw motivation or sheer force of will. Each one redesigns either the cue, the friction, or the immediate reward around the behavior, so that the desired habit becomes the path of least resistance, and the undesired one becomes just inconvenient enough to lose its grip. It's worth taking a moment to talk about why this framework lines up so well with what we actually know about how the brain works, because none of this is just clever marketing language. It's grounded in real, well-established behavioral science. Deep in the brain, there's a structure called the basal ganglia, which plays a central role in pattern recognition and storing automatic behaviors, including emotional responses and habits. As a behavior gets repeated enough times, control over that behavior gradually shifts away from the parts of the brain responsible for conscious decision-making and over to this more automatic system. This is precisely why well-established habits feel almost effortless: brushing your teeth, driving a familiar route, while new behaviors feel exhausting. They're still being run by the slower, more energy-intensive conscious mind, rather than the fast, efficient automatic system. Dopamine plays a starring role here too, and not just as a pleasure chemical, which is actually a common misconception. Dopamine release is tied to anticipation and prediction at least as much as it's tied to the reward itself. This is exactly why the craving phase of a habit loop, the moment right before you act, can feel so intense. Your brain is already releasing dopamine in anticipation of the reward before you've even gotten it. This is also exactly why so many modern products, social media feeds, slot machines, junk food, are engineered, deliberately or not, to maximize that anticipatory dopamine spike, keeping you locked in a craving loop that's much harder to walk away from than simple pleasure alone would explain. There's also strong research behind the power of small wins and visual progress tracking, tying back to that habit tracking tool we discussed earlier. Studies on motivation consistently show that visible evidence of progress is one of the most reliable drivers of continued effort, often more reliable than the size of the eventual reward itself. This is part of why watching a streak grow on a calendar can feel so satisfying. You're not just building a habit, you're giving your brain a steady stream of small, real evidence that the effort is actually working, well before the final outcome arrives. Since this framework became widely known, people across an enormous range of fields, athletes, entrepreneurs, students, parents, have applied some personalized version of it. A pattern shows up again and again in how people describe their experience. It's rarely a dramatic, overnight transformation. It's a slow, almost boring sense of accumulating momentum, where, somewhere around the second or third month, they suddenly realize the habit they once had to force themselves into has quietly become something they'd actually miss if they skipped it. Another consistent pattern is that the people who stick with this longest are rarely the ones with the most impressive willpower. They're the ones who got the most honest with themselves about designing their environment and their systems, rather than relying on raw discipline to carry them through. People who initially describe themselves as having zero self-control often end up just as consistent as naturally disciplined people, once they stop trying to win through willpower and start winning through smart design instead. Of course, it's worth being realistic here too. This framework isn't a cure for every obstacle someone might face. Someone dealing with a clinical mental health condition, a genuinely chaotic or unstable living situation, or a serious lack of basic resources may need additional support well beyond a habit tracking app or a cleverly designed environment. But as a general, evidence-based approach to building sustainable behavior change, for the vast majority of everyday goals people set for themselves, this system is remarkably effective and remarkably accessible. Let's get practical and walk through an actual plan you could start tonight, broken down week by week, so you're not left wondering exactly where to begin. In week 1, pick just one single habit you want to build, not 3, not 5, just one. Write it down using the implementation intention format we covered earlier, a specific behavior at a specific time in a specific location. Then scale it down using the 2-minute rule, so small that skipping it would feel almost silly. The entire goal this week is simply proving to yourself that you can show up, not achieving any meaningful result yet. In week 2, add a visible tracking method, a calendar on your wall, a habit app, even just a tally on a sticky note. Each day you complete the habit, even the absurdly small 2-minute version, mark it. This week, also take 5 minutes to look at your environment and ask, what's one small change I could make that would reduce the friction standing between me and this habit? In week 3, look for one opportunity to use habit stacking, attaching this new habit to something you already do automatically every day, so the cue becomes nearly impossible to forget. Also start paying attention to your language. Notice whenever you catch yourself saying, "I'm trying to," and consciously shift it toward "I am," reinforcing the identity behind the behavior rather than just the behavior itself. In week 4, allow yourself to very slightly scale up the habit, not dramatically, just enough to stay in that Goldilocks zone of being a bit more challenging without becoming overwhelming. This is also the week to do your first honest reflection. Ask yourself what's working, what isn't, and what one small adjustment might make the whole system run more smoothly going forward. And here's the most important note about this entire 4-week plan. You don't need to wait for some perfect starting date. The single best moment to begin is right after you finish hearing this sentence. Pick the habit, write down the tiny 2-minute version, and do it today, even if today is already halfway over. Before we move into the final part of this video, let's do a quick recap of everything we've covered, so you walk away with a clear, organized picture in your mind. First, the foundational principle. Lasting change comes from systems and identity, not from goals and willpower alone. Goals are useful for setting direction, but it's the daily system and the underlying belief about who you are that actually determines whether change sticks. Second, the math of compounding. Small, 1% improvements repeated consistently produce dramatically larger results over time than people expect, while results often stay hidden beneath the surface for longer than feels comfortable. The plateau of latent potential before suddenly becoming visible. Third, the habit loop. Cue, craving, response, reward, the universal mechanism underlying every habit you have, good or bad. Fourth, the 4 laws for building good habits. Make it obvious through awareness, implementation intentions, habit stacking, and environment design. Make it attractive through temptation bundling and surrounding yourself with the right social norms. Make it easy through reducing friction and the 2-minute rule. And make it satisfying through immediate rewards, visual tracking, and accountability. Fifth, the 4 inversions for breaking bad habits. Make it invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying. The exact same 4 laws, simply flipped in the opposite direction. Sixth, the advanced tools that make this sustainable for years. The Goldilocks rule for staying in that sweet spot of difficulty. The professional mindset of showing up regardless of mood, and regular honest reflection to keep your habits aligned with who you actually want to become. And finally, remember the core message underneath all of this. You don't need to transform your entire life overnight, and frankly, trying to do that almost always backfires. You just need to win today, in some small, almost unremarkable way, and then do that again tomorrow, and the day after that, trusting that those tiny, atomic actions are quietly compounding into something far bigger than any single one of them could ever suggest on its own. To be fair and balanced, let's spend a moment on a few legitimate criticisms and limitations of this framework, because no single approach to behavior change works identically for everyone. The first criticism is that this framework can sometimes feel almost too individualistic, placing the entire responsibility for change squarely on personal systems and environment design, while underplaying very real structural barriers, like financial hardship, unstable housing, demanding caregiving responsibilities, or limited access to time and resources in the first place. Someone working 3 jobs to make rent genuinely has far less room to redesign their environment than someone with a stable, predictable schedule. And it's worth acknowledging that honestly rather than implying that anyone who fails to build new habits simply isn't trying hard enough. The second criticism is that an intense focus on optimization and self-improvement can occasionally tip over into a kind of low-grade anxiety, where rest, spontaneity, and simply being present in the moment start to feel like wasted time unless they're justified by some kind of productive habit attached to them. It's worth remembering that this framework is meant to be a tool in service of a life you actually want to live, not a permanent, anxious scoreboard you're being graded against every single day. The third criticism, similar to one that comes up with most behavior change frameworks, is that no system, no matter how well designed, replaces genuine intrinsic motivation and a real sense of meaning behind the habit. Environment design and clever tricks can absolutely help you get started and stay consistent in the short term. But over the long run, habits that are connected to something you actually care about tend to outlast habits that are purely the product of clever design with no deeper why behind them. Taking these criticisms into account, the fair takeaway is this. Treat this framework as an extremely useful, evidence-based toolkit, not as a rigid, one-size-fits-all formula, and not as a substitute for addressing real structural challenges in your life that may need other kinds of support entirely. Let's run through a few frequently asked questions before we move toward the final close of this video. Question 1. How long does it actually take to build a new habit? You may have heard the popular claim that it takes exactly 21 days. That number isn't well supported by actual research. Realistically, it depends heavily on the complexity of the habit and how consistently you perform it, and can range anywhere from a few weeks to several months. The far more useful question isn't how many days, it's how many repetitions, since consistency, not the calendar, is what actually drives the automaticity of a habit. Question 2. What if I try to build several new habits at once? Generally, this isn't a great idea, especially at the start. Each new habit you're consciously building draws on a limited pool of attention and self-regulation. Trying to overhaul your exercise routine, your diet, your sleep schedule, and your reading habit all in the same week dramatically increases the odds you'll burn out on all of them simultaneously. It's almost always more effective to fully establish one habit first, until it requires very little conscious effort, before adding the next one. Question 3. What if my environment genuinely can't be changed much? For example, I share a small space with family members who aren't on board with my new habit. In that case, focus on whatever small slice of control you do have. Even something as minor as a particular chair you always read in, a specific time of day that's reliably quieter, or a single drawer dedicated entirely to your habit's tools, can serve as a powerful enough cue, even within a shared or constrained environment. Question 4. Is this framework only useful for things like fitness and productivity? Not at all. People apply these exact same 4 laws to building stronger relationships, deepening a spiritual or meditation practice, managing chronic health conditions, improving their finances, and learning new skills or languages. The framework is essentially content neutral. It's a structure for behavior change in general, regardless of what specific behavior you're trying to build or break. Question 5. What's the single most important thing to remember if I only take away one idea from this whole video? Probably this. Focus on becoming a slightly different person today through one small, almost embarrassingly tiny action, rather than trying to force a completely different life into existence overnight. The tiny action is never the point in itself. It's a vote for the identity you're trying to build, and identities are built one vote at a time. Let's tie all 4 laws together with one complete worked example. Because seeing them stacked on top of each other in a single real scenario makes the whole system click in a way that hearing them one at a time sometimes doesn't. Imagine someone who wants to build a consistent exercise habit, but has failed at this exact goal multiple times before. Using the first law, they make it obvious. They write a specific implementation intention. I will exercise for 2 minutes at 6:30 a.m. in my living room. And they lay their workout clothes out on the floor the night before, right where they'll step out of bed, so the cue is physically impossible to miss. Using the second law, they make it attractive. They join a small group chat with 2 friends who are also building a fitness habit, turning the behavior into something socially normal and even a little bit fun, rather than a lonely, private chore. Using the third law, they make it easy. They commit to literally just 2 minutes of movement, removing any meaningful friction or decision-making, since 2 minutes requires almost no motivation to begin. And using the fourth law, they make it satisfying. They mark a big visible X on a wall calendar every single day they complete it, and they text their small group chat a single checkmark emoji right after finishing, getting an immediate, tiny hit of social reward the moment the habit is done. Notice that nothing about this plan relies on raw motivation or impressive willpower. Every single piece of friction has been engineered out of the system in advance, and every available source of small, immediate reward has been deliberately built in. After a few weeks of this 2-minute version running on autopilot, scaling up to 5 minutes, then 15, then a full workout, becomes dramatically easier because the foundational habit, the simple act of showing up at 6:30 in workout clothes, is already automatic. Now let's run through the same 4 laws in reverse, using a real example of breaking a bad habit, since the framework works just as cleanly in that direction. Imagine someone who wants to cut down on mindless phone use late at night, a habit that's wrecking their sleep. Using the first inversion, they make the cue invisible. They physically charge their phone in the kitchen overnight, completely out of reach of the bedroom, and they delete the 1 or 2 specific apps that pull them in most aggressively, rather than trying to white-knuckle their way past notifications every single night. Using the second inversion, they make it unattractive. Instead of thinking, I can't use my phone before bed, they reframe it as, I'm becoming someone who protects my own sleep and my own mind, turning the restriction into something that feels like self-respect rather than deprivation. Using the third inversion, they make it difficult. They log out of every app on their phone each night, so that even if they do reach for it, getting back into anything requires several extra, slightly annoying steps, just enough friction to interrupt the automatic reach. And using the fourth inversion, they make it unsatisfying. They set up a small habit contract with a friend, agreeing to send that friend $5 every single time they catch themselves scrolling in bed past 11 p.m., turning a previously invisible, costless habit into one with an immediate, tangible consequence. Again, Notice that none of this depends on simply trying harder to resist temptation in the heat of the moment. The entire bad habit has been systematically dismantled in advance, at the level of cue, craving, response, and reward, so that by the time 11 p.m. actually arrives, there's very little temptation left to resist in the first place. To make all of this even more immediately usable, here's a quick set of starter templates you can adapt to almost any habit you're trying to build across a few different areas of life. For health and fitness, a simple stack might be: after I pour my morning coffee, I will do 10 squats next to the kitchen counter. For finances, something like: after I get paid, I will immediately transfer 10% into a separate savings account before I see the rest of it land in my checking account, removing the temptation to spend it first and save whatever's left over, which for most people in practice means saving nothing at all. For learning a new skill or language, something like: after I sit down for lunch, I will spend 5 minutes on a language app before I pick up my fork. And for relationships, something like: after I get into bed at night, I will ask my partner one specific question about their day that isn't just, "How was your day?" turning a vague, easily skipped intention into something concrete enough to actually happen, night after night, almost on autopilot. Before we get to the final close, I want to talk about something a little uncomfortable but genuinely important: the hidden cost of small bad habits, a cost that almost never shows up in any obvious way until it's already accumulated into something much bigger. Think about a single late night of scrolling instead of sleeping. On its own, it's nothing, barely worth mentioning. A single skipped workout, a single unnecessary purchase, a single short, sharp moment of impatience with someone you love. None of these in isolation do any real damage. But none of your habits actually exist in isolation. Each one is a single repetition in a pattern that, left unexamined, repeats itself hundreds or thousands of times over the course of a year. And it's that repetition, not any single instance, that quietly determines the shape of your health, your finances, your relationships, and your sense of who you are. This is exactly why bad habits are so much more dangerous than they initially appear. They're rarely catastrophic in the moment. They're catastrophic in aggregate, in what they compound into after being repeated without examination for years on end. And this cost almost never announces itself clearly. There's no single notification that tells you, "This specific scroll session is the one that's quietly reshaping your relationship with focus and attention." The cost only becomes visible much later, as a kind of vague, accumulated gap between the life you're actually living and the one you imagined for yourself. The encouraging side of this same idea is that the exact same compounding works in the opposite direction, and it doesn't require some dramatic, singular turning point to start working in your favor. The version of you who reads 10 pages tonight instead of scrolling, who does 5 minutes of stretching instead of skipping it entirely, who responds to one stressful moment with a little more patience than usual, isn't doing anything that looks remarkable on its own. But that single choice, repeated honestly, day after day, is exactly how an entirely different trajectory gets built, one small, almost invisible vote at a time. So tomorrow, when you're standing at one of those small decision points, the snooze button, the extra snack, the open notebook versus the open phone, remember that you're never really choosing just for that one moment. You're casting a vote for the kind of person you're slowly becoming. The question worth asking yourself isn't, "Does this one choice matter?" It's, "What does this choice say about the identity I'm building, repetition after repetition, over the months and years ahead?" There's a pattern worth noticing when you look closely at people who have built genuinely remarkable careers, health, or relationships across almost any field. It's rarely the result of one single, dramatic decision. It's almost always the visible result of small, repeated systems that, on any individual day, would look completely unremarkable to an outside observer. An elite athlete's morning isn't defined by one extraordinary training session. It's defined by literally thousands of ordinary ones, repeated with a level of consistency that, frankly, looks almost boring from the outside. A successful writer's career isn't built on one inspired, all-night writing binge. It's built on the unglamorous habit of sitting down and writing a little bit, most days, for years, whether they feel inspired that particular morning or not. A financially secure person's wealth usually wasn't built on a single brilliant investment. It was built on small, automated, repeated decisions about saving and spending, made consistently enough, for long enough, that compounding eventually did the rest of the work on its own. This pattern carries an important implication. If you're waiting to feel a surge of motivation before you start building a new habit, or waiting for some single, decisive moment of transformation, you may be waiting for something that essentially never arrives in the way you're picturing it. The people who actually get where they want to go usually didn't wait for that feeling. They just kept showing up to a deliberately small, sustainable system. On the unremarkable days just as much as the inspired ones, and let the slow compounding of those repeated choices do the heavy lifting over time. Let's bring this back to where we started. A teenager lying in a hospital bed with a shattered skull, with no idea whether he'd ever walk normally again, let alone play sports at a competitive level. Nothing about his recovery involved one dramatic, heroic moment. It involved tiny, almost forgettable daily habits, showing up to physical therapy, doing the small exercises his body could actually handle that particular day, tracking minor improvements that, on any single day, looked like nothing at all. You probably don't have a story quite that dramatic. Maybe all you have is a quiet, nagging sense that you could be living a little closer to the life you actually want. But here's what both situations genuinely share. Real change never starts with some massive leap. It starts with one small, almost laughably modest action, repeated with enough consistency that it eventually compounds into something the person who started it would barely recognize. So let's take one small action together, right now. Pick exactly one habit you want to build. Shrink it down using the 2-minute rule until it feels almost too easy to count as meaningful. Write down exactly when and where you're going to do it today, not tomorrow, not next Monday, today. And then go do that one small thing right after this video ends. Before you go, let's do one short visualization together. Close your eyes for a moment if you can, and picture yourself exactly 1 year from today. Picture a version of you who's been showing up for that one small habit imperfectly, but consistently, for the past 12 months. Notice how that version of you walks into a room. Notice the quiet, settled confidence in the way they talk about their own goals, not because every part of their life has become perfect, but because they've proven to themselves, small repetition after small repetition, that they're someone who actually follows through. That version of you isn't some distant fantasy. It's simply the natural, almost mathematical result of one tiny decision, repeated enough times for compounding to take over. And the only real distance between you and that version of yourself is the next small, 2-minute action you choose to take, starting today. Thanks for staying with this video all the way to the end. Your next atomic habit is waiting for you, right now, in whatever you choose to do in the next 2 minutes.